Hi everybody, my name is Tom. I'm actually in technical rehearsals right now for the Cryptic Pit Party at the Barbican. So I've actually recorded this about 2 weeks in your past, so I can be with you today. Probably a pretty apt reason to be missing my time with you all. It's a collection of deaf, disabled and neurodivergent artists who've all made short shows and are going to be in a showcase at the Barbican. It's actually on tonight and tomorrow in relation to when this is being played, if anybody's in the area and fancies coming along. What I'm actually here to talk to you about today is disabled-led governance. And whenever anybody mentions disability in cultural institutions, especially in relation to governance, it's normally followed by a conversation around accessibility. What I want to ask, though, is whether accessibility is really enough. Now, what I want to do today is give you a lot of easy solutions because there's no simple solutions to complex problems. But I do hope to give you some tools to begin to pick apart structural ableism in your organizations or your boards, and hopefully a bit of a direction to begin moving in. But before we get into it, let's talk about why I'm having this conversation. So, who am I? Well, the simplest part of who I am is that about 3 days a week, I'm the head of development for a theatre company called Stockroom. I lead on the fundraising. But outside of this time, it gets a bit more complicated and I do a few different things. I'm a writer and a theatre maker. So, as I mentioned, I'm currently doing a show at the Barbican. Next week, I open a show called Education Karaoke at Camden People's Theatre, about 20 years of state education. And earlier this year, my show, Can You See Into a Black Hole, about my experience of growing up with epilepsy, was commissioned and ran outdoors in Covent Garden. As well as that, I'm probably thought of as a producer a little bit, but I think of it more as organising. This does include some traditional producing. This year, I'm supported with a bursary from Stage 1, but I also do things like consultancy. I mainly work supporting neurodivergent arts workers and arts leaders to develop fundraising strategy or business strategy. Maybe the most relevant thing for this presentation is that I'm the trustee of an organisation called Unlimited, who are a disabled arts commissioning organisation. Now, what I've just told you is my professional class CV. I've just told you the things I have to say to justify my existence in spaces like this. But now I want to talk about who I am really. Well, I grew up in Doncaster, in one of the poorest areas of the country. My family danced above and below the poverty line for most of my childhood. Culture with a big C couldn't have mattered less to me for a long, long time. This was compounded by the fact that when I was 8 and camping with my dad in Scarborough, I had my first epileptic seizure. I was sleeping and then kicked my dad awake in the tent and conveniently went into cardiac arrest. This is often more commonly known as SUDEP, which is sudden death in epilepsy. However, I survived thanks to my dad and a fireman that was a few tents away. For about 10 years, I had seizures in my sleep, which came with a risk of stopping breathing every time. This came to define most of my life. I spent a large portion of my childhood in hospitals, and the medical world became very comfortable to me. These kind of seizures stopped when I was 18. My brain was left with the effects of 10 years of major neurological events. For all of this time, medicine encouraged me not to use the word disabled. It encouraged me to think of myself as, and I quote my doctors, normal. Despite having spent years making work about epilepsy and disability, it wasn't until I was diagnosed with ADHD at 26 that I felt confident enough to occupy that identity with the language that I use now. And I'm telling you all this because conversations about being a trustee or about governance are normally bathed in professional class social codes and histories, and I'm probably not that. I'm quite erratic, I'm pretty common in my taste values, and this presentation looks more like a video game than it does a conference presentation. Boards have been cultivated for a long time to become mechanisms that give organisations access to wealth networks. But if we keep doing this, it's going to do nothing for diversity. If we only ever speak about governance in the modes of middle class, non-disabled respectability, we won't see any kind of real change at any kind of reasonable rate. I also want to quickly clarify an idea that I'm going to be using in this presentation before I really get going. It's a concept which I think is the bare minimum for arts leaders in terms of what they should understand. And this is the social model of disability. What I just described at my upbringing was the medical model of disability, where medicine acts as a gatekeeper to who gets to understand themselves as disabled. Here's a quote from the Shape Arts website about what the social model is, which puts it much more succinctly than my ramblings ever will. The social model holds that a person isn't disabled because of their impairment, health condition, or the ways in which they may differ from what is commonly considered the medical norm. Rather, it is the physical and attitudinal barriers of society, prejudice, lack of access adjustments, and systematic exclusion which disables people. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm not doing a big explainer about the social model. I'm hoping that a lot of you already understand it. But if you don't, I really encourage you to go and do some really basic research around it. Okay, so what is the problem that I'm going to talk about today? Now, although I don't think the Arts Council's national portfolio should constantly be held up as a yardstick of what the arts is, because a lot of culture exists wildly outside of it, it does serve a purpose in terms of data collection so that we can understand the problem. So I'm going to use some of the latest MPO data, which it's from a few years ago now, just in order to demonstrate the problem that I'm talking about. So if you look at the latest available MPO data and crunch some of the numbers, and across the national portfolio, there are 7,524 trustees. Of those trustees, only about 542, or about 7%, identify as disabled, which stands in pretty stark contrast to the fact that latest data suggests that about 20% of the UK are disabled. I think this problem is further articulated when you consider that of all of these trustees, 1,220 have an unknown disability status. There's actually almost over twice the number of trustees that we don't know the disability status of than there are actual disabled trustees. But what does this really mean? I think we all understand that the importance of representation, but what are the real world consequences of this lack of disabled governance? Well, consider a person who's disabled in some way and they're trying to work in an arts organisation that is still ultimately structurally ableist. It's going to be very difficult to hold down that job. Leading an arts organisation when you're also having to deal with societal marginalisation is pretty exhausting. That structural ableism can often lead to what is perceived as the failure of that individual, which will then jeopardise, the sustainability and stability of their income source. However, if disabled people are the best people to dismantle ableism, so how do we make progress if we can't get in and then survive in leadership positions in the organisation in the first place? Well, governance might be an answer to that. There's a complexity here I won't go into around how disabled people shouldn't be doing free labour to achieve our freedom. But governance structures give people the opportunity to hold to account and ensure that structural ableism is dismantled in organisations without it being connected to how we pay our rent. Governance gives disabled people an opportunity to prepare the ground for arts leaders that are disabled, to get organisations to a point of being able to support that disabled leader who can then in turn lead change from an executive level. Now, I don't think change should always come from the top down, but I do think it is one viable tactic in terms of institutional level ableism. And what it does is that when you have disabled governance, it creates a knock-on effect. So as you can see on the screen, disabled board members can begin to dismantle institutional ableism, which then makes space for viable executive disabled leaders, which then makes space for disabled communities, disabled participants, other disabled workers. The refusal to include disabled people in your governance structures speaks only to an organisation's lack of desire to deconstruct structural ableism. So, what are we going to do about this problem? Well, when I talk about this, most people reach for the idea of accessibility, but let's look at a few accessibility techniques that you might choose to use and see how they play out. One thing you might try is offering more BSL or captioning support to people who want it, but what people don't realise often is this is an act of translation. A lot of people who use BSL, BSL is their first language, English is their second language. Of course, it's our short-term solution, But what would be better is if things like BSL were part of the way we communicate. You know, if BSL were taught in schools, or if we weren't always so obsessed with communicating orally, it doesn't stop the ableist structure to include a BSL interpreter. It just allows a person to interact with what's happening. Let's look at support workers as the second option. The problem's probably a bit more obvious here. The need for a support worker recognises whatever structure you're working in is ableist, and that someone therefore needs another person to mediate that ableism. It doesn't actually stop the ableism existing, it just mediates it, it just provides a buffer. The next time a disabled person tries to interact with that structure, with that institution, they're going to need an access support worker again because nothing has changed. What about audio description or screen readers then? Well, it's great, but it can be very difficult to remember a lot of audio information via audio description, not screen readers. Again, it's almost an act of translation. And it doesn't change the fact that society has largely ignored the possibility of learning how to present large amounts of information in non-visual ways. We're obsessed with infographics. What you see here is that the opposite of ableism is not actually accessibility. Accessibility is more like a plaster that you can put over an ableist structure. It allows a disabled person to participate without actually necessitating any kind of structural change. Simply providing accessibility techniques so that trustees or prospective trustees can access the non-disabled way of doing governance isn't a long-term solution. It's not attractive to look at a board and think that they are still structurally ableist. In order to demonstrate my point here, I just want to share an example of what we experienced at Unlimited. I've got a quote on screen from a blog, which is a conversation between Joe, who's the executive leader of Unlimited, and Saoirse, who is also a trustee with me. To become a charity, there's a lot of paperwork. As part of this process, we were required to read and sign some forms. For me, that's pretty annoying, but relatively simple. There was one form which had to be printed and hand signed, but this in itself was ableist. Saoirse's blind, that document couldn't be provided in a screen reader format, and they wouldn't allow a form of consent which was non-visual. Saoirse says in the blog, due to significantly large amounts of text I had to be read to. This way I do not process things as easily as if I was reading them independently. It took an incredible amount of time. I then had to be assisted to sign documents, which I found to be an additionally stressful and demeaning process. I've not created my own writing since I was very young, and to do so added unnecessary stress to what we were being told should be an inclusive process, end quote. At Unlimited, we were able to provide the accessibility support. We paid for a support worker, but the structure itself that we're working in was still ableist. I mean, there's also a question about what it means to give visual consent in this way as a blind person. This shows hopefully what I mean when I say accessibility is not enough. If the process is still demeaning, if the ableism still exists, people don't want to become your trustees. So when I say accessibility is not enough, what does actually change in the structure look like? And what have we done at Unlimited? Well, here's a few tactics that we've begun to employ. I think the first question to ask yourselves is how and when you meet as a governance structure. There's a very basic consideration in here that if you're meeting in person, then some disabled people might be clinically vulnerable and therefore not able to attend right now during the pandemic. But also Unlimited, we've changed the structure of our meetings. So every second meeting, we don't all sit around a table or a big Zoom and go through a linear agenda. Sometimes people's access needs rub against each other, and it means that large groups are just simply accessible to some people. So we have meetings which normally look like smaller groups with specific tasks, or might look like drop-in sessions, or it might look like that there's a week's window where you can choose when you contribute to certain prompts on a Google Doc. In order to do this and get through our business, we have to meet 6 times a year instead of the minimum of 4, but this was a necessary structural change in order to end the ableism of large group meetings. Next, I think the second prompt to consider is how and in what forms meetings are recorded. Now, we have to produce minutes. It's a requirement of governance. But are your minutes templates already formatted to be screen reader friendly? Do you know how to do that? Could you audio or video record meetings so people can listen to them? If you're meeting on Zoom, this is pretty simple to do. Could you present your minutes in a format which isn't exclusively visual, or could you present them in an easy read format? Actually, can make them more concise and much more direct to present them in an easy read format. And then a third prompt I want to give you is, how else can people engage? What are these structural alternatives to engagement? There's a basic fact that often with disabled people, there are medical considerations which might prevent us from being at a meeting at short notice, or maybe like me, people might struggle to manage time and miss meetings. What structures are in place to allow this? And by structures, I mean, consider what your required quorum is at meetings. Does it adequately allow for absence, and can you change it? Is there a window after a meeting where anybody can contribute to minutes before they're published? Can people send material in advance because the agenda has been circulated at irregular and appropriate times? Are you sending people reminders? These are all like super simple solutions, but I can appreciate they sometimes feel big. At Limited, we were lucky. We were forming a board for the first time, so we weren't weighed down by the baggage of history. We could set our standards from the very beginning, and we're still now learning and having conversations as trustees about what else we might try next. Obviously, it's not as simple as just waking up tomorrow and doing it. I get that. There are structures at play that affect governance, and our interactions with these structures has to be considered if we intend to dismantle ableism. I want to talk through a few barriers and a few structural barriers, especially that you might encounter in this process. The first is the Charity Commission itself. So we within cultural governance are bound by the requirements of the Charity Commission a lot of the time. I gave you an example earlier of how these requirements enacted ableism within our board. It's going to require commission change as well as governance change, and that is going to be something that we all collectively have to work towards. The second is about labour and money. We live in a financial system which values people predominantly in terms of their ability to carry out profit-making labour. This is an inherently ableist standard and can often put restrictions on the action we can take because the changes we want to make affect profits or affect financial viability. The solution to this is, again, to then change the financial system that we exist in. There's no end to ableism, unfortunately, where we value people only in terms of their labour. The third is fundraising needs. I'm a fundraiser myself. I know that declining arts funding over the last decade has seen us need to fundraise in different ways and more extensively. This often required us to access wealth networks in order to engage philanthropy. This is problematic in itself, as there's no democratic oversight over philanthropy and any kind of ableism it might display. But also, boards have widely become structures that allow us to access wealth networks. Governance is about accountability, and we should be held accountable to the public. If we're in receipt of public money, we shouldn't be held accountable exclusively by rich, white, non-disabled individuals because it is absurd to claim they represent the public. This funding ecosystem is something as well that we're all going to have to work together to change. Now, I appreciate I've just thrown a lot of information and a lot of provocations at you very quickly, because I'm not here to pretend, like I said, this is an easy solution. I'm actually not here at all to give you a neat solution, because I don't think we have the answers yet. But I'm also not here to give you permission to not take action because do you think it's difficult to make change? I asked at the beginning if accessibility is enough. Well, you probably guessed that the answer is no. Sure. We have to continue to use accessibility techniques, but we also have to strive to make them redundant by changing the ableist structures in the first place. We can't do the same kind of governance and just add accessibility. We have to change governance itself, and by extension, the structures that affect governance. Believe it or not, I didn't survive 10 years of neurological events that should have killed me because I wanted to spend my life tackling ableism in cultural governance. Love being here. Didn't think it was where I was going to be at this point in my life. I'm not invested in keeping the system going, so I still have gigs on the speaker circuit or consultancies to do. I've actually got a lot of other things to be getting on with. So what I'm asking you today is to please make the kind of change that cheats me out of a job. every year that goes by where this conference happens and we're talking about the same thing is another year where the change hasn't happened. The call to action from me today is not to attend the conference and nod along and be polite and respectable. The call to action is to make this conference and conference like it entirely redundant. Sorry, Claw. Anyway, for now, that's it from me. Thanks for hearing me out. You can find me at Boy and Pen across all socials, whatever exists, I've probably got it. But I will see you shortly to do my chat with Joe. I think you're gonna break now. And Joe and I are going to chat about the practicalities of enacting some of these structures and how we found working together. Thank you very much for hearing me out.